Imagine owning your home outright at 72 years old.
Right, like no mortgage at all.
Exactly. Completely paid off. You've lived there for decades. Now imagine losing that home anyway and ending up sleeping in your car simply because your property taxes and, insurance premiums just doubled in a matter of 2 years.
Which completely eclipses a fixed pension.
Right. And that is not a hypothetical. I mean, that's the lived reality for people like Alan Gunter. And it's this hidden reality of Florida right now. Because when you lose your housing in America, just crossing a state line completely rewrites the rules of your survival.
It really does. It's basically a geographical lottery.
Yeah. How you experience being unhoused, what resources you get, even what laws you break just by existing outside. It varies drastically depending on exactly where you are standing.
Yeah, the systemic framework in one state can be completely unrecognizable compared to its direct neighbor. You might find this really robust safety net in one zip code and then severe criminal penalties literally in the next.
Which is the entire mission of this specific deep dive. We are building a perfectly homeless state scorecard for the state of Florida. We're going to evaluate the real-world conditions, the systems, and most importantly, the lived realities that shape daily life for people without a home.
And for you listening, we're not just giving you a number up front.
Right, no spoilers. This score is going to evolve dynamically during our conversation. We're building it policy by policy, reality by reality.
So to really ground this evaluation, we have to look at the sheer scale and the profound demographic shifts happening in Florida right now.
Right, let's look at the numbers.
Based on the 2025 point-in-time counts, there were 28,498 unhoused individuals across the state. Now, historically, some people point to that as a success story, because that number is down from a peak of over 48,000 back in 2007.
I mean, yeah, I look at a drop like that and the immediate assumption is, oh great, the crisis is shrinking.
Right, but diving into the actual data, the nature of the crisis hasn't shrunk at all. It's just transformed into something much harder to see. The demographic shift is severe.
How so?
Well, while the visible street population has kind of fluctuated, the hidden numbers are just staggering. During the 2023 to 2024 academic year, public schools in Florida identified over 97,762 students experiencing homelessness.
Wait, almost 100,000 kids? Just in public school system?
Yeah, and the vast majority of them are categorized as doubled up.
Meaning what, exactly?
That means multiple families are squeezed into a single-family apartment or home. They're often sleeping on floors or couches, just doing whatever it takes to avoid the street.
Wow.
And if you look at Central Florida specifically, children and seniors now make up over 40% of the homeless population there.
40%.
Yeah, so we are seeing this massive wave of economic displacement rather than just individuals struggling with, traditional chronic issues like severe mental illness.
Which means we need to start our scorecard by looking at the very beginning of the pipeline, right? Housing affordability.
Yeah.
Like, what is the systemic math facing a renter in Florida right now?
Well, the defining characteristic of Florida's current housing market is just extreme escalation. I mean, between 2019 and 2023 alone, the median gross rent statewide surged by 39%.
39% in 4 years.
Right. And if we focus on a major economic hub, like Orlando, the average two-bedroom apartment now sits around $2,300 a month.
Jesus.
Let's break down the systemic math of that reality. Florida's minimum wage is currently $14 an hour. So, to afford a standard one-bedroom apartment without spending more than a third of your income, which, is the standard metric for housing stability,
Right.
A person earning that minimum wage has to work 90 hours every single week.
90 hours. That is literally more than 2 full-time jobs just to keep a roof over your head. I mean, it's mathematically impossible to sustain that level of labor, especially if you have kids or, health issues. It's like a game of musical chairs where the chairs don't just disappear, they just get exponentially more expensive every single round.
That's a great way to put it, and it forces us to look at what happens when these workers try to improve their situation. The sources detail this phenomenon called the benefit cliff. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah. It's brutal.
It's one of the most insidious systemic traps in the modern labor market. When a low-wage earner is relying on federal or state assistance like housing subsidies, SNAP benefits, child care vouchers, whatever those programs have hard income caps.
It's like climbing a ladder where the rungs just suddenly vanish the higher you go.
Exactly.
Like you might get a $1.50 an hour raise at your retail job, which adds, maybe $3,000 to your annual pre-tax income?
Roughly.
But crossing that specific income threshold immediately disqualifies you from, like, $10,000 in crucial benefits. The system mathematically penalizes you for upward mobility. It doesn't just keep you stagnant, it can financially ruin you for accepting a promotion.
Yeah, and the population getting hit the hardest by this math isn't just the working poor, it is the elderly. We have roughly 700,000 fixed-income seniors in Florida who are now severely cost-burdened.
Right, because their income doesn't change.
Right. Their Social Security checks have remained relatively flat, while their property taxes, their insurance, their rents have just hyperinflated. I mean, they are making daily choices between paying for a roof or buying their heart medication.
Which is just a horrifying choice to have to make.
And the supply of affordable units simply cannot absorb the demand, which is driven heavily by this mass migration of higher earners moving into the state.
Yeah. So taking all of that extreme market pressure into account, this lowers the overall picture for our evolving scorecard. The systemic math simply does not support the bottom rung of the economic ladder.
No, it doesn't.
So if a family or a senior loses that battle against affordability, the next logical step is seeking emergency shelter. What actually happens when someone tries to find a bed in Florida?
Well, Florida maintains an infrastructure of approximately 18,250 shelter beds across the entire state. And during recent counts, those beds were sitting at an 86% occupancy rate.
Which effectively means functional zero. I mean, if a system is running at 86% capacity constantly, it means beds are turning over.
Yeah.
But there's virtually no slack in the system on any given night, right?
Exactly. Especially in dense urban centers like Miami-Dade, that lack of surplus capacity is critical. But the deeper context here is this massive ideological shift in how those shelters are actually funded and operated.
Okay, tell me about that.
So historically, there was a heavy federal push for the housing first model. The philosophy there is that you provide an individual with unconditional permanent housing, and once they're stabilized, then you wrap around services to deal with addiction or mental health.
Right. Get them a roof first, then fix the other issues.
Right. But Florida is actively abandoning that model.
Because they're pivoting to a treatment-first model.
Yes. Under the current state administration, state funding is increasingly being redirected to shelters and programs that mandate sobriety, strict behavioral rules, and mandatory workforce participation as a precondition for residency.
Wait, but I'm looking at the demographics we just discussed, and the friction here just seems immense.
Yeah.
Like, I understand the intent. They're trying to break the cycle for the 17% of the unhoused population suffering from severe mental illness, or the 13% battling substance abuse.
Sure.
But if a shelter requires absolute sobriety, strict curfews, and mandatory workforce participation, how does that accommodate the 72-year-old senior whose homelessness is purely economic? What about a single mom with a teenager, or someone who works the night shift?
That is the exact systemic friction that service providers are warning about right now. These high barrier entry points filter out the most vulnerable. I mean, many of these strict compliance shelters do not accept pets, for instance, which forces people to choose between a bed and their only companion.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
It is. They also often separate older teenage boys from their mothers due to liability policies. And as you mentioned, strict evening curfews make it physically impossible to hold down a second shift or a night shift job. So for economically displaced individuals, these rules can make the shelter system entirely unworkable.
The system is demanding behavioral compliance from people whose only failure was an inability to afford a $2,300 rent check.
Exactly.
Well, factoring in the high occupancy rates and these high barrier policies, this shifts the score for our evaluation. And since we've covered the initial collapse of affordability and the shelter bottleneck, it's time for our midpoint score moment. If you're looking at your screen, you'll see our draft score overlay appearing right now.
Yeah, and for you listening, I really want to emphasize that this is our draft score. Factoring in the severe affordability gaps and the increasingly conditional access to emergency shelters, the draft score is currently hovering in the territory between a C- and an F.
But this is absolutely not the final score.
No, definitely not.
Because the realities we're about to cover, specifically how the state polices the people who are locked out of both housing and shelters, are going to drastically alter this result, which forces us to look at criminalization and enforcement. If the shelter is full or you just don't qualify, you are on the street. So how does Florida treat the physical act of existing in public space?
To understand the street-level reality in Florida, you really have to look at House Bill 1365, which was signed into law in 2024.
Right.
This legislation fundamentally reshapes public space by instituting a blanket ban on public camping and sleeping on public property. We're talking sidewalks, parks, right-of-ways, all of it.
Now, a lot of states have camping bans, obviously, but the mechanism Florida uses to enforce this is entirely unique, isn't it? Like, they aren't just telling police to arrest people, they're weaponizing civil litigation.
Yeah, that is the defining feature of HB 1365. Starting in January 2025, the law actually empowers private citizens, business owners, and the state attorney general to legally sue local city or county governments if those municipalities fail to clear out homeless encampment.
That's wild. We're essentially deputizing private citizens to hold a financial gun to the head of local mayors.
Pretty much.
If a city decides they want to tolerate a small encampment because their shelters are full, a local business can just sue the city for financial damages, which forces the municipality to prioritize police sweeps just to avoid litigation bankruptcy.
And the criminal justice impact of this approach is highly visible. I mean, in Miami Beach, prior to the statewide expansion of this logic, a municipal report noted that 40% of all arrests made by local police involved homeless individuals.
40?
Yeah, you have this massive pipeline directing unhoused people straight into the county jail system.
But I want to look at the fiscal data on this because the math doesn't add up for me. Jail is famously the most expensive form of public housing in existence. So what is this punitive approach actually costing the state?
It's a lot. Studies focusing on Central Florida found that the taxpayer cost to criminalize and manage a chronically homeless person, and we're factoring in jail stays, police labor hours, the inevitable emergency room visits, it averages $31,065 per year per person.
Wow. Okay.
Conversely, placing that exact same individual in permanent supportive housing costs taxpayers approximately $10,051 a year.
So we are paying a $20,000 premium per person just to enforce a punitive system rather than a supportive one?
That's what the data shows.
But, okay, we have an impartiality rule on this deep dive, and we need to adhere strictly to it. We aren't here to take a political side. So, objectively, what are the stated goals of HB 1365 from the perspective of the policymakers who actually drafted it?
Right. The legislative intent is firmly rooted in public sanitation and community safety. To be completely objective here, the proponents of the law argue that unmanaged encampments create severe biohazard conditions.
Okay.
They argue it restricts the rights of tax-paying citizens to use public parks and that these camps correlate strongly with localized petty crime. The stated goal is to end de facto street living entirely and use the threat of law enforcement to compel individuals out of the shadows and into structured, state-sanctioned environments where they can be pushed into necessary behavioral and addiction treatment.
So the logic is that you cannot let people slowly deteriorate on a public sidewalk.
Right.
But this brings up the classic squeezed balloon problem, doesn't it? If you squeeze a balloon, the air doesn't just disappear. It moves to the path of least resistance.
Exactly.
So if public sleeping is a crime and you are constantly being swept by police to avoid citizen lawsuits, and the shelters are at 86% capacity with these strict entry rules, where do people physically go?
The data shows they retreat. They move further into the woods, into hidden, unsafe peripheral areas, or very commonly they retreat into their vehicles.
Right. Well, based on this, the current draft score is taking a serious hit, which leads us directly into evaluating vehicle dwelling friendliness. Because if you can't sleep on the street, the car seems like the ultimate final safety net. And looking at the text of HB 1365, the state actually acknowledges this, right? There's a specific carve-out in the law for vehicle living.
There is, yeah. The state statute explicitly exempts people sleeping in a motor vehicle from the broader public camping ban.
Okay, that sounds promising.
But the exemption is highly conditional. It only applies provided the vehicle is registered, actively insured, and parked in a place where it may lawfully be.
That phrase, lawfully parked, is a trap, isn't it? It looks like a safe harbor from the state, but the minute you try to utilize it, you hit a web of local landmines. The state law might exempt you, but local municipalities have their own codes.
That is exactly the issue. Cities like Key West and Sarasota, they have strict, localized ordinances that ban overnight street parking or prohibit sleeping in vehicles entirely within city limits.
Wow.
So the state exemption does not protect you from a local police citation. And if you attempt to retreat to, say, state-managed highway rest stops to avoid city police, the Florida Department of Transportation legally caps your stay at exactly 3 hours.
3 hours. So there's basically no legal overnight solution on public land.
None.
And the most dangerous trap in this entire ecosystem is the DUI law. Let's break down the actual physical control doctrine, because this criminalizes the very act of trying to survive safely.
Yeah, this is huge. Under Florida law, you do not have to be driving a vehicle to be charged with a driving under the influence offense. The state operates on this doctrine of actual physical control.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means if a person has a few drinks, realizes they shouldn't drive, and responsibly decides to sleep it off in the backseat of their parked car, they are still at risk. If the keys are in their pocket or anywhere within reach, law enforcement can argue they have the actual physical control to potentially start the vehicle.
Wait, even if the engine is completely cold and they are asleep in the back?
Yes. And you have to compound that legal doctrine with the environmental reality of the state. I mean, surviving the extreme subtropical heat inside a metal car in Florida is physically dangerous.
Absolutely.
To avoid heat stroke, dwellers frequently have to turn on the engine to run the air conditioning for short bursts. Doing so while having alcohol in your system, even if parked completely legally, practically guarantees a DUI charge.
And a DUI results in an immediate license suspension, thousands in fines, and jail time. I mean, for someone living in their car, losing their license means losing their shelter, their mobility, and usually their job. It's a catastrophic, insurmountable barrier.
It really is. It transforms the only remaining shelter into a precarious legal trap.
Based on the impossibility of navigating those overlapping jurisdictions safely, this lowers the overall picture for our scorecard. But we have to look at the other side of the ledger. While the state is heavily policing public space, what are they doing to actively pull people out of this cycle? Let's evaluate outreach and social services.
Right. So in tandem with the camping ban, the Florida legislature did recognize the need for increased capacity. They allocated $30 million in new funding specifically dedicated to expanding emergency shelters and ramping up substance abuse and mental health treatment.
Okay, that's a massive sum of money.
Yep.
And a necessary recognition that you cannot arrest your way out of a psychiatric crisis.
It is a direct injection of capital aimed at addressing that 17% of the population with severe mental illness.
But how is that money actually being deployed on the street?
That is where the tension lies. Because of the strict enforcement mandates of HB 1365, outreach is increasingly coupled with law enforcement sweeps.
Oh, I see.
Instead of a social worker building long-term trust with an individual over weeks, you often have social workers arriving alongside police officers who are actively dismantling an encampment. It creates an inherently coercive environment for outreach.
Yeah, that's tough. And there's also a major mathematical disconnect happening in the outreach data. Right. The sources highlight the situation in Northeast Florida. They utilize what's called a by-name list, which is this highly effective outreach tool where social workers know the specific identities and needs of the unhoused individuals in their area.
Yeah, it's a great system.
The data shows their by-name list is actually dropping. Like they're successfully navigating people through the bureaucracy and placing them into housing. But simultaneously, their overall point-in-time counts are rising. How does that make sense?
That divergence is the most critical indicator of the broader systemic failure. It means the inflow of newly displaced people is completely outpacing the medical, treatment, and outreach solutions.
Oh, wow.
The service providers are highly effective, They are bailing water out of the boat at a record pace, but the economic displacement caused by rent hyperinflation is just ripping wider every single month. The outreach systems are functioning, but they're overwhelmed by the macroeconomic tide.
Still, a $30 million state investment into behavioral health infrastructure is a tangible, significant resource that just did not exist previously.
Yeah.
So this raises the overall picture for the scorecard.
Definitely.
But outreach and treatment only work if there's a permanent door to walk through at the end of the process. Which brings us to our final evaluation, pathways to permanent housing. How do you actually escape homelessness in Florida?
The primary mechanism the state is relying on is the Live Local Act. This is a massive piece of legislation designed to incentivize developers through major tax exemptions and zoning overrides to build what they call workforce housing.
Okay.
The objective is to flood the market with units that are affordable to people earning between 80% and 120% of the area median income.
And here is where the systemic mismatch becomes glaringly obvious. The Live Local Act is fantastic if you are a first-year teacher, a young professional, or a mid-level service worker trying to stay in the city. But let's look at the actual definition of affordable under that act.
Right.
In a city where the area median income is high, an apartment priced at 80% of that median might still cost $1,800 a month. As we established, the fastest-growing demographic of unhoused people in Florida are fixed-income seniors. An $1,800 apartment does absolutely nothing for a 72-year-old surviving on a stagnant $1,200 Social Security check.
Exactly. The market incentives simply are not reaching the bottom rung of the economic ladder. Developers have no financial incentive to build housing for the extremely low-income bracket, even with those tax breaks.
Wow.
As a result, Florida currently remains short roughly 1.5 million affordable units for extremely low-income households. The state is basically relying on private market mechanisms to solve a public welfare crisis, and the math just does not align.
We do see some localized bright spots, though. The sources point to Broward County, which has initiated a formalized, safe parking program. It provides security, sanitation, and a legal place for families to park overnight. Fort Lauderdale is actively experimenting with pallet shelters to rapidly transition people off the sidewalks into dignified, lockable micro-shelters.
Yeah, and those local pilot programs are really innovative, but they are localized bandages on a statewide arterial bleed. The macro pathway to permanent, deeply affordable housing is fundamentally blocked for the people who need it most.
Which shifts the score one last time. We've evaluated the economic realities, the shelter barriers, the legal traps of survival, and the structural housing deficits. It's time for our final summary. We need to lock in the grades and reveal the final, perfectly homeless state score for Florida.
Summarizing the landscape, Florida's strengths are found in its willingness to experiment at the local level with safe parking and pallet shelters, coupled with that significant $30 million legislative injection into behavioral health and addiction treatment infrastructure.
But the weaknesses are systemic and severe. There is intense state-mandated criminalization of public space enforced through citizen lawsuits. Rent inflation has entirely decoupled from minimum wage realities. The legal environment for those forced into their vehicles is incredibly hostile, specifically regarding those physical control DUI traps. And the state's primary housing solution fundamentally bypasses the fixed-income seniors flooding into the unhoused population.
Right, so based on that synthesis, here are the official category grades for Florida. For housing affordability, the grade is an F. For shelter access, a C-. For criminalization and enforcement, an F. For vehicle dwelling friendliness, an F. For outreach and social services, a C+, and for pathways to permanent housing, a D.
Factoring in those grades, the final perfectly homeless state score for Florida is a D-.
Yeah. Florida earns this specific score because it is a state in profound structural collision. It has paired some of the most extreme housing cost inflation in the country with some of the strictest enforcement and criminalization policies in the nation. It has effectively removed the physical and legal space for poverty to exist without providing a mathematically accessible safety net to catch the hundreds of thousands of citizens currently falling through the cracks.
It is a harsh, granular reality. But before we wrap up this deep dive, you always leave us with a broader question to consider. What is the final thought for today?
The thought I want to leave you with goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. We noted that almost 100,000 Florida public school students are currently living doubled up in precarious, overcrowded housing. They hang on by a thread, just one minor disruption away from the street. I want you to consider the geographic reality of Florida. What happens to this already fragile, legally constrained, and overburdened housing system the very next time a major Category 5 hurricane hits the coast and physically wipes out the state's last remaining pockets of aging, low-income housing stock?
That's the perfectly homeless state score for Florida. But here's the bigger question. Would you go to perfectlyhomeless.com and click the Buy Me a Coffee link? A small donation will really help. Let me know in the comments, and if there's a state you'd like to see next, tell me below. This is a 50-state journey through how America actually treats people without housing, and every state tells a different story. If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. We're the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore. It's happening in every state, every city, and more neighborhoods than most people realize. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Take care, dwell well, and we'll see you in the next state.